sóng vô từng lớp xa.
Do you ever wonder how refugees ended up all around the world, or how people risked their lives to escape war and government? The Vietnam War began in 1959, and it all started when North Vietnam wanted control of South Vietnam, with the goal of uniting the entire country into a communist country. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union and many other communist countries such as China, while South Vietnam's ally was the United States. The US supported the South because they did not want the spread of communism, and they feared it would form a domino effect on the countries around Vietnam as well. The leader of the North Communist Party was Ho Chi Minh, and the capital was Hanoi. The South was under a capitalist republic, which was led by Ngo Dinh Diem, and its capital was Saigon. As the US wanted to resist the spread of communism in countries, they were involved in the Vietnam War for 25 years. They supported South Vietnam by training Vietnamese troops. During 1963, President John F. Kennedy sent 16,000 military troops to help train the Vietnamese troops. In 1964, 2 U.S. ships were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is near North Vietnam. This led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution that was passed by Congress in order to support any necessary measures for the U.S. to repel armed attacks. Therefore, this gave President Johnson consent to use force against North Vietnam, and he increased the amount of armed forces in Vietnam, and he consented to a series of bombing campaigns. After 500,000 U.S. military personnel were stationed in Vietnam, the Soviet Union and China decided to give their weapons to North Vietnam. But the cost of the war was adding up to be $77 billion a year, and this was too much for the U.S., therefore, the U.S. combat units withdrew from the war in 1973. 2 years later, the North invaded the South, and the war ended with North Vietnam taking over the South and uniting Vietnam as one nation. Once the North seized control of all of Vietnam, the previous South Vietnamese people feared the communist government would take away their freedom. Therefore, the reunification led to a large population of the Vietnamese to escape Vietnam in search of a constitutional republic. The Vietnam War was an impactful event on refugees, as escaping Vietnam caused people to separate from their families and friends. Although the people who stayed in Vietnam after the war were forced to live differently. A few examples of this are the communist government taking money, they took over businesses, increased taxes, and forced children and adults to support the new government. However, people who left Vietnam as refugees had to start over their lives in different countries by learning new languages, finding new jobs, and going to new schools. Although it was difficult to assimilate into the new countries, as people were skeptical of the refugees and people also took advantage of them. When the North took full control of South Vietnam, more than 1.2 million refugees left Vietnam. These refugees included the Vietnamese boat people, Montagnards, Hmong, and the Khmer Krom. As there were different groups, they ended up in different places around the world. Starting with the boat trips from Vietnam, which was a very influential factor to the separation of refugees. Most people who left Vietnam on ships had to depart from their families and friends because the cost of the boat tickets were very high. Often the ships were small and cramped, and families had to separate.
My escape was very difficult because I was, at that time, was only 14 years old. I was very, very scared at that time because I had to spend three nights and 4 days on the boat. Very small boat. My boat has about 50 people. I had to separate from my family, my parents and my younger brothers. 3 youngest brothers still left behind.
In addition, each boat went to different places, which furtherly separated friends and families. The most popular places were the United States, Indonesia, Malaysia, Europe, and Thailand. Although the boat seemed like a promising way to leave Vietnam, the boat trip itself was extremely dangerous. The North Communist Police constantly patrolled the oceans, and they sent the Southern Vietnamese to jail and refugee camps if people were caught escaping Vietnam. Not only that, but pirates from Thailand hijacked the Vietnamese boats because they knew that people had brought values with them. They took the jewelry on the boats, killed men, and took advantage of women to take them as slaves. Because the boats were tiny and cramped, many people died of seasickness and starvation. Because of this, escaping on boat was not very reliable, and about 10 to 70% of the people did not survive the boat trip.
I tried at least 15 times in order to get on the boat. And once on the boat, my life was in danger. There was a pirate boat behind our boat, follow us, and the captain of my boat tried very hard to speed up, and luckily the pirates went left. There was a big storm that my boat had to encounter big wave, and my boat almost sank. At that time I was so scared, and then I prayed every single minute that I could survive and see the land.
Another important refugee group were the Montagnards, who were executed because of their religion, and they later on escaped to Thailand. Montagnards were good Vietnamese warriors, and they lived in the Central Highlands. They consisted of dozens of different tribes. During the war, they fought alongside with the US soldiers. They were even tortured to renounce their religion, to the point where they died. The communists sent large groups of them to re-education prisons. The Hmong and the Khmer Krom are similar groups that went through the same situation as the Montagnards. The Hmong is an indigenous group that lived in the North Highlands, and they are also being persecuted because of their religions. Similarly, another minority group called Khmer Krom were also being persecuted for being Christian. Some people from these groups escaped to Thailand, although the conditions for living in Thailand were rough for them. It was better than living in Vietnam. But since the refugees in Thailand were living there illegally, they were not provided with healthcare and financial assistance. They also struggled with finding jobs, and when they did find jobs, employers took advantage of them by forcing them to work at low wages. However, they could not complain, or they would be reported for illegally staying in Thailand. Back in Vietnam, workers and families' daily lives were changed as the communist government was implemented. It started with the communists taking expensive belongings from the common people of the South. They tried controlling everything by taking money from businesses and controlling them. The North was relatively poor, which is why they took money. Whereas the refugees who resided in the US had a hard time assimilating to the new country because they needed to learn a new language in order to go to school and find jobs. Older Vietnamese people who learned English had strong accents, and it made it harder for people to understand them. The Vietnamese people who did not learn English were offered low-paying jobs because it was difficult for them to communicate with others. It was evidently hard for the Vietnam refugees to adjust to their new lives, but Americans made it more difficult. This is because Americans had controversial opinions about the Vietnamese Americans residing in America. Firstly, they thought the influx of Vietnamese would cause a drain in job opportunities, as there was a huge addition of Vietnamese that needed jobs. Additionally, in a 1975 Gallup poll, 54% felt like the Vietnamese refugees should not be permitted in America. Some Americans even made false accusations about the refugees. For example, people in Texas said that refugees were illegally fishing.
When I arrived to the US, it was very difficult for me because I didn't know much in English. So I had to study days and nights. I had to work part-time after school so I can support my living. And at night, mostly I miss my parents and my family a lot. I cry most of the time, and I have to write letters to them.
Overall, the results of North Vietnam taking over South Vietnam caused many people's daily lives to change. But in order to escape this government, many people had to leave on boats that were dangerous due to storms, pirates, starvation, sickness, and cramness. When Vietnamese refugees arrived to different places around the world, it was hard to assimilate into the new countries because society intimidated them. They also had to find jobs and learn different languages, which was very difficult. The people who decided to stay in Vietnam were affected by the government because their valued belongings were taken, and the people who believed in certain religions were persecuted, causing them to elude from Vietnam. The escaping of the refugees of the Vietnam War represents a turning point in history because it caused many families to separate in fear of communism. It also forced the Vietnamese people to start over their lives in different countries with opposing opinions. They also had to escape Vietnam without knowledge of what their lives would be like in a completely new country.